Of all the places in the world you could hang out, the morgue has to be at the bottom of most people's lists. Maybe as a visitor, you'd be willing to breeze through, but as a resident, there's no fun at all. In general, the morgue is a grim place, but it turns out when you dig a little deeper, things actually get even worse. Number 10. Friends stole John Barrymore's corpse from the morgue. It's never easy to say goodbye to someone you love, whether that's a friend or family member. Losing a person often feels like losing a part of yourself, and in the immediate aftermath, your grief can feel like you're losing yourself. How we deal with our grief will vary from person to person, and you may have heard there's no wrong way to express that emotion. That said, we could probably all agree that some ways of expressing grief are more unusual than others, and some are frowned upon. Actors Errol Flynn and W.C. Fields were known to be good friends with John Barrymore. The famous actor and grandfather of Drew Barrymore was a staple of Hollywood's golden age. He died of cirrhosis of the liver and pneumonia in 1942, and his friends didn't take it very well. After he passed, W.C. Fields and Sadakichi Hartman went to the city morgue and stole Barrymore's body. According to Flynn's memoirs, Barrymore's aunt was so distraught that she needed to see him one last time, so they convinced the mortician to let them borrow the corpse for an hour. That and a $200 bribe sealed the deal. The body was brought to Flynn's house and placed on the couch as a prank, and then they waited for Flynn to get home. Flynn supposedly freaked out on the porch of his house, and then the others returned the body, having suitably traumatized Flynn. Number 9. Cruise ships have morgues big enough for several bodies. For a certain group of people, a cruise is the absolute epitome of a luxury vacation. A beautiful resort on the sea with all the amenities. I mean, what more could you ask for? And sure, cruises have been known to be troubled now and then, but most of them turn out fine, right? Nothing is always fine, though, and cruise ships have to be prepared for that. People live on board these vessels for weeks at a time, and over 30% of the passengers are over 60. About 14% are actually over 70, so it's not impossible to imagine a scenario in which a passenger might pass away rather unexpectedly while a ship is out at sea. For that reason, though they tend to never advertise it, every cruise ship is equipped with a morgue. The morgues have small refrigerators able to accommodate several bodies. In a pinch, a walk-in freezer can actually be used. Apparently, if something extremely unforeseeable took out enough passengers, the ship would call for air assistance and a helicopter could transport the bodies back to land. As many as 200 people per year actually die on cruise ships, so it's just a part of standard procedure. Any ship should be able to handle 6 to 10 bodies. Number 8. There are about 40,000 unclaimed bodies in morgues around the US. Have you ever seen a TV show or a movie when someone has to go to the morgue to identify a body? Often it's a big emotional reveal, and we discover the deceased isn't who we thought it was. But what happens then? In real life, what happens if no one can identify the body? It turns out it happens more often than you might think. A lot more often. The real numbers are sobering and pretty sad too. There may be as many as 40,000 unclaimed bodies in morgues around the United States. In 2021, there were 2,510 unclaimed bodies in Maryland alone, about 4% of the state's total. Some of those unclaimed bodies are those of homeless people who had no friends or family to claim them, but not all. There are a number of unclaimed bodies that have families and loved ones who refuse to come and claim them. Sometimes it's a simple matter of not being able to meet the financial burden of a burial, so they simply leave the body where it is and let the state worry about it. Different locations deal with this in different ways. Los Angeles buries unclaimed bodies in a mass grave every 3 years. In 2016, the county buried the remains of 1,400 people in a mass grave. Number 7. You can buy a corpse from a Philippines morgue to fake your own death. Every so often, a movie comes along in which a character fakes their own death as part of the plot. In real life, this happens as well, but it's remarkably rare. Hard to say how often though, since if it works, we never know about it. If you're ever moved to do this yourself or suspect someone else has done it, you may want to look towards the Philippines. Turns out there's a lucrative industry there for death kits. That's the thing where you pay about £350 for forged documents that say you died, but more importantly, you get an actual corpse. We just mentioned the US has an abundance of unclaimed bodies, but so does the Philippines, and people started selling them to fake deaths. There have been a few documented cases of travelers getting caught doing this. It's also worth noting, as a 1PI pointed out, that if you engage in this transaction, you are dealing with criminals who now have serious blackmail dirt on you, so they can continue to milk you for more money afterwards. Fake your own death at your own risk. Number 6. Parents of a teen who died discovered his brain had been kept in the morgue in a jar. Picture the scenario. You're in high school and a friend and classmate dies in a car crash. It's tragic and people are distraught, but life goes on. Time passes. Months later, you're on a field trip with the Forensic Science Club from your school, and you head to the city morgue. While you're there, you see a jar on the shelf, and it contains a human brain, and on the outside of the jar is a label with a name on it. This is the name of your friend who died in the crash. The morgue has been keeping his brain on a shelf for a few months. I mean, what do you do with that information? For some kids in New York who this happened to for real, they ended up telling the sister of Jesse Shipley, who died in a car crash in 2005. Shipley's parents had known that their son was being autopsied, but they also later buried him, assuming his body was intact. Medical examiners defended their actions by pointing out that determining cause of death is not a fast process, and in this case, they needed more time to gather evidence. The brain needs to be kept in fluid for weeks to prepare it for examination, and in that time, bodies are usually buried. They were simply following normal procedure. The family disagreed and sued, but the court sided with the city. No rules were broken, and the pathologist was doing what their job required of them, while the family was able to bury their son according to the ruling. Number 5. The Paris morgue was once a hotspot for entertainment. In the modern age, horror movies are big business, and fans love to watch a little grisly mayhem. You could argue it's in our DNA. People love the macabre as witnessed historically in cases like the Paris morgue being a jumping destination for a night on the town. In the 19th century, the Paris morgue was like the zoo. People would show up to gawk at the corpses. If someone died mysteriously, crowds would form that were so large they spilled onto the street and stopped traffic. Everyone wanted to see the victims for themselves. The death of one little girl brought 150,000 people to come and see her. The story in the paper was one thing, but people wanted to see it themselves. It was bringing a grisly story to life, so to speak, and it was a huge form of entertainment. Vendors sold food outside. Police had to keep the peace since the crowd often got rowdy. It was like an outdoor concert, but with dead bodies instead of bands. Number 4. People still regularly wake up in morgues. There's an oft-told story about how long ago some coffins had little strings in them to allow the occupant to pull on them and ring a bell should they wake up decidedly not dead and find themselves in need of rescue. In the modern world, we don't bury people with bells, but some folks do still wake up in the morgue. One woman woke up in the fridge after being declared dead 11 hours earlier. Another man was just about to be embalmed when he came to. So how does this happen? In the US at least, most coroners are elected officials and don't actually have medical training, so they have no qualifications to actually determine if someone is dead or alive if it's not readily apparent as it would be to any layman. Number 3. There's a photographer who gets his subjects from morgues. Many artists seem to benefit from a muse. John Carpenter loved working with Kurt Russell, Andy Warhol was inspired by Eddie Sedgwick, and Joel Peter Witkin has corpses. He uses bodies from morgues, and to say his work has been controversial is to grossly undervalue the word controversial. His work includes images that most horror movies wouldn't use. He sourced many of the bodies in his works from Mexico, where a deal he struck with a hospital let him use unclaimed bodies and parts to stage his photos. The end results are beauty to some and nightmares to others. Number 2. An Idaho coroner was accused of using human remains as fertilizer. In general, there are a few things you'd expect to happen with human remains. An examination to determine cause of death, maybe a full autopsy, embalming, cremation, burial, and not much else. So when a coroner decided to take some remains home to use as garden fertilizer, well, that was not usual. That was an allegation made by a deputy coroner in Canyon County, Idaho, back in 2018. This was one of several accusations lodged against the coroner, which also included harassment and creating a hostile work environment. Whether any of that was ever proven remains dubious, as there seems to be little media follow-up. Number 1. Legally selling human body parts is worth millions. We saw that there's a market for bodies to fake deaths already, and you've likely heard stories for years about black market organs for sale. Well, things get so much worse, and legal too. If you ever lost someone and made arrangements for the body, you may have been approached by someone with a deal. You can get a cheaper funeral or cremation if you donate the body for study. You know, for science, advanced medical studies they call them. Your loved one's body becomes the property of a body broker if you agree to this deal. This is the part where it becomes a full-on horror movie nightmare. In Nevada, residents living near a funeral home started noticing a seriously rank smell. Also, someone was dumping blood-soaked boxes in the dumpster. Cops showed up to investigate and found a man in scrubs in the yard hosing off a frozen human torso with a garden hose in the middle of the afternoon. Bits of corpse ran down the street in the gutters. The company sells body parts for research and study, not for transplant, which is regulated. As such, there are few, if any, laws governing the practice. The bodies were not obtained illegally, and they don't need to meet any medical requirements. The brokers cremate some of the body as promised, and the families get what they asked for. The company keeps the profitable parts and sells them to schools or research facilities for a huge profit. At least one company was making over $12 million per year, and in 4 states that track data on these bodies between 2011 and 2015, over 50,000 bodies and 182,000 body parts were shipped around. In one case, a man made over $13 million in 6 years selling diseased parts that he'd cut up with chainsaws and preserved in coolers full of mouthwash.